At high noon in a crowded Madras street, a thin, middle-aged lawyer tears off his shirt, lifts his bare chest, and walks straight toward a line of British soldiers aiming rifles at his heart. People scream, shopkeepers slam their shutters, even seasoned policemen hesitate. The officer gives the order, "Aim!" And the man who does not flinch is the same man who once begged for a job as a lowly clerk just to buy his school books. That man is Tanguturi Prakasam. Before he became the Lion of Andhra, before he stood in front of guns and defied an empire, he was a frightened village boy in a world where his name meant nothing. To understand how a quiet child from a dusty village grew into someone who would rather be shot than step back, we have to go back to the late 19th century, to a place that barely appeared on the colonial maps. The village of Kanuparthi lay under the brutal sun of the Madras presidency. The air shimmered over dry fields. The monsoon sometimes arrived late, sometimes not at all. Huts made of mud and thatch huddled together, buffaloes shifted in the dust, and the tallest building was often not a temple, but the local revenue office where the British government's orders were translated into ruinous taxes. In one of those huts on 23rd of August 1872, a boy was born to a modest Brahmin family. They named him Prakasam, light. No one there imagined how bitterly the empire ruling over them would one day learn that name. His father died when he was still a child. In a world with no social security, no safety net, that death was not just a private grief, it was an economic disaster. One day there is rice in the pot. The next day you're deciding who in the family will skip dinner. His mother, Subama, became both parent and shield. By the flicker of an oil lamp, she would press a palm to his hair and say, "Your father is gone, but his name is not. You must carry it." Outside, jackals howled. Inside, a new kind of hunger was growing in the boy. Hunger not just for food, but for education, for escape. The British school in the nearby town smelled of ink, chalk, and something more intoxicating, possibility. For a village boy to sit in a classroom, to hold a book printed in far-off London, was to touch a door leading out of centuries of submission. But that door was expensive. Fees, books, transport, every rupee had to be fought for. Prakasam helped with odd jobs, ran errands, walked miles barefoot on stony paths just to reach the classroom before the teachers. Cain descended on latecomers. His clothes were simple, often worn thin. When it rained, his books were wrapped in old cloth to keep them from turning into pulp. There is a memory people in the region would recall later. A thin teenager, face sharp with determination, standing under a tree reading, our lips moving silently over English sentences while cattle grazed nearby. Sometimes village elders would laugh, "Why cram your head with the white man's language? You think you'll become a sahib?" He didn't answer. He just turned another page. Around him, the machinery of the empire clanked on, invisible but merciless. A missed tax payment meant land confiscated. A quarrel with a local official could mean prison. And in those moments of injustice, when a weeping farmer stood before a court, unable to understand the law that was crushing him, a thought began to form in the young boy's mind. Someone has to fight this, but to fight them, I have to learn their weapons. He finished his initial schooling through sheer stubbornness, but higher studies were a different mountain to climb. His mother's eyes were already ringed with fatigue. The household budget was an endless series of painful choices. Buy food or pay fees. Replace a broken pot or buy a second-hand dictionary. So he did what many ambitious young men of his time did. He started working as early as possible. He became a schoolteacher for a while, earning a modest salary and discovering that he liked the feel of chalk in his hand and arguments in his classroom. He was strict but not cruel. When a student slipped in a lesson, he would pause and break down the idea until the boy's face lit up in understanding. Teaching gave him dignity. It did not give him enough money. The legal world, on the other hand, shimmered with opportunity. In dusty district courts, men in white dhotis waited outside doors, while inside, black-coated lawyers spoke in thunderous English, quoted arcane laws, and walked out with both reputation and rupees. Lawyers were feared, respected, sometimes hated, but never ignored. That was the life he wanted. He managed to get work as a clerk in a lawyer's office in Rajamundry. From the outside, it might have seemed a small job, organizing papers, copying petitions, sweeping up after senior advocates left. But for Prakasam, every page was a lesson. He would read the petitions as he copied them, tracing the shape of a legal argument the way a musician studies notes on a page. That cramped office became his real classroom. The smell of old paper and ink replaced dust and chalk. When the senior lawyer dictated, his words about jurisdiction and precedent were like a foreign tongue. But slowly, line by line, the language of the law unlocked itself. It was here that he first encountered something else: competition. Among the clerks and junior pleaders was another young man from a far wealthier background. He came from a landed family, wore crisp clothes, and had the gleaming confidence of someone who never had to count coins before buying food. He saw at once that this quiet boy from Kanuparthi was not content to remain a clerk. In the corridor, their paths would cross. The other youth's smile was polite, but his eyes were cold. When clients came in, he would step forward, speaking in English as if he owned the very air in the room. Behind his back, he would say, "That one? He thinks he'll argue before the High Court. He doesn't even own a proper pair of shoes." That silent rivalry, born in a cramped office, would follow Tanguturi Prakasam for decades, shifting from courtrooms to councils, from whispered comments to open battles for power. It began here in youth as a simple question: which of these two men would climb higher and how far? To climb at all, Prakasam needed one thing the most: education in law. And in that era, the ultimate stamp of legal authority came from one place: London. For a boy whose village barely escaped famine each year, the idea of crossing the sea was almost obscene. It was expensive. It was risky. It meant leaving his mother alone. It meant braving the social taboo many Orthodox families still held against sea travel. But it also meant something else: walking into the heart of the empire that had reduced his people to subjects. There was a deadline. If he wanted to enroll for the incoming term and sit for the necessary examinations, he had to leave within months. The ship wouldn't wait. The bar admissions calendar wouldn't adjust for a poor boy from Kanuparthi. The clock began to tick. He scraped together funds from borrowed money, small savings, the sale of whatever little the family could spare. Nights were spent calculating, recalculating, wondering if it was madness to risk everything on a voyage. His rival, who had family wealth behind him, watched with a hint of amusement. "If you fail there, you will have nothing when you come back," he remarked one evening, almost casually. "Better stay here, be content. There's work for everyone, if they know their place." Place. That was the word that stung the most. For centuries, people like him had been told their place: under landlords, under collectors, under the white man's boot. His whole life so far had been a quiet rebellion against that single idea. On the morning he left, the village road to the nearest rail station seemed to stretch endlessly. His mother walked with him as far as she could, every step a struggle between pride and fear. At the edge of the village, she stopped, pressed a small packet into his palm: some coins, a bit of food, and a faded piece of cloth that had belonged to his father. "Remember," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you are not going there for yourself alone. You are going for all of us who cannot go." The train's whistle cut through the air like a knife. Time was up. He climbed aboard. The voyage to England was not the smooth journey of a colonial official in first class. Steerage was cramped, noisy, and airless. Men lay on narrow bunks, seasick and homesick. The stink of salt and sweat thickened the cabins. On deck, icy winds from the North Atlantic cut through thin Indian shawls. He saw the Suez Canal as a scar cut through desert, a symbol of how far the empire would go to shorten its path to profit. He tried to study on board, but the ship tossed relentlessly. Still, by lantern light, he would open his borrowed law books, the words blurring as the sea heaved. Every page he turned was a quiet act of defiance against the fate that had been assigned to him at birth. When he finally stepped onto the cold, gray streets of London, it was like landing on another planet. The sky hung low, the fog tasted of coal, and people hurried past in wool coats, barely sparing a glance for the thin brown man clutching a worn suitcase. Here in the imperial capital, he was just another colonial subject, interesting at dinner parties perhaps, but always slightly less than the Englishmen around him. Boarding houses looked at him with suspicion. Landladies warned him what cutlery to use, as if he might contaminate the spoons. At public places, conversations would sometimes stop when he entered. Yet in the law colleges and inns of court, the rules were different. Marks didn't care where you were born. Exams did not ask whether your father owned land. Either you passed or you failed. And again, there was a deadline. He had limited money. Every week in London burned his savings. If he didn't clear his exams quickly, he would be stranded, unable to stay, unable to go home with honor. The pressure was relentless. Winter nights in unheated rooms froze his fingers. He would breathe onto them to thaw the stiffness before turning another page. Tea and stale bread became his standard dinner. Letters from home arrived months late, bearing news of small joys and large worries. Meanwhile, he could not escape the fact that at the finest London dinners, British officials spoke about our Indians as if they were a commodity, not a people. Newspaper cartoons mocked dark faces and turbans, the funny natives who needed to be ruled. Each insult was not a sudden shock, but a slow acid drip. It hardened something in him. When he finally walked into the hall to sit his crucial examinations, he carried more than a pen. He carried years of sacrifice, his mother's hopes, his village's whispered doubts, and the unspoken question of whether a man like him could stand equal before the laws the British had written. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silent hall. The supervisor announced the start. He unfolded the question paper with steady hands. What happened inside those hours of scribbling answers will never be fully known to us. But we know this. He passed. He was called to the bar. The boy from Kanuparthi had become barrister Tanguturi Prakasam. When the news reached home, neighbors who once shook their heads at his mad dreams now spoke of him with awe. Our Prakasam has become a barrister in England. Mothers pointed him out as an example to their sons, and somewhere in the district his old rival in the lawyer's office heard the news and felt a cold jolt. The race had entered a new phase. Returning to India, he stepped off the ship not as a struggling clerk, but as a qualified barrister with the right to practice in the highest courts. The same empire that had looked down on him now had to recognize his credentials. Judges in Madras would address him with respect. Clients would come on their own. He chose to begin practice back in the Andhra region in Rajamundry, where the familiar streets and the Godavari River framed his first great successes. In the hot, crowded courtrooms, he stood in a black coat that was slightly too large for his lean frame, cross-examining witnesses, challenging police evidence, tearing holes in the prosecution's fabric. Word spread quickly. There's a new barrister in town. He's sharp. He doesn't fear officials, and he talks to poor clients like they are human beings. Soon, wealth followed. Fees increased. He could send money home. The boy who had once counted every coin could now afford better clothes, better meals, a better house. Success tasted sweet, but success also carried a trap. As his name grew, so did invitations to elite clubs where Indian notables met beneath portraits of British monarchs, to gatherings where district officers smiled affably, assuring everyone that reforms were coming in due course. Here, men who dreamed of political careers rubbed shoulders with men who wanted favors, contracts, titles. Among them, moving smoothly, was his old type of rival, the ambitious lawyer who believed the future lay not in challenging the British, but in cooperating with them. These men spoke the empire's language perfectly. They knew which hands to shake, which words to avoid. For them, the path to power ran through compromise. For a time, Prakasam navigated this world cautiously. He admired certain British virtues: discipline, order, learning. He was not at first the raging nationalist he would later become. Like many educated Indians around 1900, he thought perhaps the empire could be reformed, nudged towards justice. But outside the polite rooms of the city, reality beat against that hope like waves against rock. In villages, tenant farmers were still whipped by revenue demands. In towns, Indian policemen still bowed to British superintendents. In courts, Indian witnesses still trembled before white judges. The tension inside him tightened year by year. He threw himself into his legal work, thinking perhaps that being a fair, brilliant lawyer was enough. Yet, whenever he won a difficult case for a poor client against powerful interests, he noticed the looks on certain faces in the back of the courtroom. Colonial officers, rich landlords, rival lawyers who believed in obedience. There was a silent message in their narrowed eyes. Be careful. Do not push too far. One evening, as he stood outside a courthouse after a particularly charged case, he noticed his rival from earlier years, now also a successful advocate, speaking quietly with a British magistrate. The two men laughed, glancing briefly in his direction. Their conversation fell silent as he approached. Congratulations on your victory, Prakasam, his rival said smoothly. But remember, too much zeal for the lower orders can be misunderstood in the right circles. Or the wrong circles, the magistrate added, almost playfully. They walked away together, leaving him standing alone on the courthouse steps as the sun set. staining the sky blood red. He had won the case, but for the first time the victory felt incomplete. At that moment, he did not yet know that within a few short years, events far away, in Punjab and Delhi, in the streets of far-off Amritsar, would shatter the illusion that the British Raj could be gently reformed. He did not know that a short, bespectacled lawyer from Gujarat named Mohandas Gandhi would soon call on men like him to make a terrifying choice: keep their prosperous careers or give them up and plunge into the storm of mass struggle. He only knew this. The law, his great weapon, was starting to feel like a chain as well as a sword. The clock of his life, which had once counted down to exams and ship departures, was beginning to tick toward a new deadline, one that would force him to decide what kind of man he truly was: a loyal barrister serving inside the rules of the empire, or a defiant rebel prepared to break them. And far away, unseen by him, that deadline was already approaching. On a warm April afternoon in 1919, in a Madras courtroom smelling of sweat and ink, Barrister Tangaturi Prakasam won the kind of case that makes a lawyer's name echo for years. The judge praised his argument. The gallery murmured in admiration. Outside, clients waited with folded hands, ready to pay fat fees. That evening, instead of going to the club to celebrate, he unfolded a crumpled newspaper and felt the floor vanish beneath him. Hundreds shot down in Amritsar, unarmed crowd, women and children trapped, Jallianwala Bagh. The words blurred. The report described General Dyer marching troops into a closed garden and ordering fire on a peaceful gathering. No warning, no escape. Bodies piled near the only exit, the earth dark with blood. Official records would later admit to hundreds killed. Eyewitnesses whispered thousands. In that small room in Madras, a man who had spent his life mastering the white man's law suddenly heard another sound underneath the rustle of the newspaper, the shattering of his faith in the system he worked inside. He looked down at his black barrister's coat, his armor, his pride, his ticket out of poverty, and for the first time it felt like a costume. The empire he had studied in London, whose courts he had served with almost religious devotion, had shown its true face. Not of cold efficiency, but of naked brutality. That night he barely slept. The ceiling fan creaked above him. Outside, a street dog barked and fell silent. Inside his head, a single question hammered away, louder than any courtroom argument. If this is what their justice looks like, what am I really doing? Days later, when Mohandas Gandhi called for non-cooperation, for lawyers to renounce the courts of the Raj, for citizens to boycott its offices and titles, it was not an abstract moral puzzle for Prakasam. It was a ticking clock. The bar would meet in just a few weeks. His colleagues whispered in corridors, counting future losses in cold numbers. Give up practice, give up fat fees, standing, contacts. Madness. Most resolved to remain where they were, inside the system where the money and security were. His old rival from those clerk days, now a sleek, successful advocate with a growing political profile of his own, found him alone. One afternoon on the veranda. "You look troubled, Prakasam," the rival said lightly, spinning a gold fountain pen between his fingers. "Let me guess. Gandhi has reached even your desk." He didn't answer. "Don't be foolish," the rival continued. "You and I know how this works. The British will shout, then pass a few reforms, give a few more Indian seats in councils. They need lawyers like us. You have a good thing here. Why throw it away for a man spinning yarn on a wheel?" Prakasam looked at him, at the perfectly ironed coat, the confident smile. This was one possible future. Wealth, gradual promotions, maybe even a title. Sir, someday. Respectable dinners, careful speeches, a life lived within boundaries drawn by others. The rival's voice softened, almost friendly. "Be practical. There is room at the top for those who know how not to offend the men who truly rule. Think about your family. Think about your mother." That last word landed like a blow. His mother, who had starved so he could study. His mother, who had sent him across oceans with a few coins and a blessing. Could he face her if he threw away everything? The bar meeting date was announced. He had days to decide. In those days, he walked the city like a man haunted. He saw policemen swaggering in the bazaar, shopkeepers bowing low, clerks jumping up when a British officer entered. Every small humiliation he had once accepted as the weather of colonial life now burned his eyes. One evening, he wandered into a crowded public meeting where speakers denounced the Amritsar massacre and the roll attacks that had sparked it. On the makeshift stage, a thin man with sharp eyes and a high, urgent voice was speaking in Telugu. "We cannot ask an empire that lives on our submission to grant us dignity," the man cried. "We must take it back, not with guns yet, but with refusal, with non-cooperation. Let their courts stand empty. Let their offices run dry. Let their railways carry no passengers if the passengers refuse." Faces in the crowd glowed in the lamplight, upturned, hungry for direction. Prakasam stood at the back, his lawyer's brain cataloging every rhetorical trick. But beneath the analysis was something raw, recognition. "This," he thought, "is the battle I always wanted to fight. Only I thought I would fight it with their law." When the speaker finished, the crowd cried, "Vande Mataram!" The sound rose like a wave. For the first time, the barrister who had spent his life in measured, precise words felt an urge to shout with them. The night before the bar meeting, he laid his black coat on the bed and stared at it as if it were a living thing. It represented everything he had once dreamed of. It had lifted him from barefoot clerk to respected barrister. It had allowed him to send money home, to walk into high offices not as a supplicant but as an equal. It also tied him to the very system that had bled Jallianwala Bagh dry. By dawn, his decision was made. In the bar hall, the air was thick with tension. Senior advocates spoke of professional duty, of law above politics. Others hinted in more honest words at fees and families. When the time came for those who would resign their practice to stand, there was a long, painful silence. Then a wooden chair scraped back. Prakasam stood, voices hushed. For a heartbeat, no one else moved. "In view of the recent events," he said, his voice steady but ringing through the hall, "I cannot in good conscience appear in courts that derive their authority from such injustice." His rival watched him with a mixture of amazement and contempt. "You will regret this," the rival murmured later as they walked out. "Pathos does not pay rent. The British will outlast Gandhi. And where will you be then? A briefless ex-barrister with no practice and no patron." "Let's find out," Prakasam replied quietly. The newspapers carried the story. Prominent Madras barrister gives up practice. Some praised him. Some mocked him as a sentimental fool. But in railway compartments and village squares, people repeated the tale of the lawyer who'd walked away from wealth for the sake of his country. The path he had chosen led away from polished courtrooms and into hot, dusty streets. He plunged into the non-cooperation movement with the same ferocious focus he once reserved for case files. He traveled by third-class compartments, cramped between bundles and sleeping children, his clothes rumpled, his eyes alive. In village after village, he stood under neem trees, speaking in Telugu and English, his voice scraping through the silence like a plow through hardened earth. "Look at this cloth," he would shout, holding up a piece of foreign-made fabric. "Every thread is paid for by the hunger of your children. Spin your own, wear your own. Let Manchester's mills tremble when we stop buying their cloth." He learned to spin the charkha. His soft lawyer's hands blistered, then hardened. Instead of judges, his audience now was farmers, weavers, coolies, women with infants on their hips. They listened to him because he did something rare. He made their pain sound like a kind of power. The British watched his rising influence with growing irritation. So did his rival, who had chosen a different road. That rival, let us now call him by his name, Narayan Rao, had thrown in his lot with those Indians who believed in constitutional cooperation. He cultivated friendships with officials, dined at their tables, applauded their gradual reforms. He spoke of order, of stability, of responsible government under the crown. What he wanted, more than anything, was power, but a safe, respectable kind, bestowed from above. Inevitably, their paths crossed again, this time in the arena of councils and legislatures. When the British, under pressure, expanded the Madras Legislative Council and allowed more Indians in, both men entered its echoing chambers, Prakasam as a fiery Congress leader, Narayan Rao as a trusted face of moderate opinion. On the council floor, their clash became public. In one debate on repressive ordinances, Narayan Rao urged cooperation in maintaining law and order. He warned that mass movements excite dangerous passions among the ignorant masses and disturb the peace necessary for progress. Sitting across from him, Prakasam felt his hands go cold. He rose, white khadi kurta stark against the polished benches. "Order?" he asked, his voice sharp. Is it order when our people are flogged for taxes they cannot pay? Is it order when the memory of Jallianwala Bagh is still fresh, and you ask us to trust the same guns that killed our brothers? Some members shifted uncomfortably. The British official presiding over the session tightened his lips. Narayan Rao replied, measured, elegant. We must be realistic, my honorable friend. The empire is a fact. We can work within it and gain concessions, or stand outside it and shout at closed doors. I prefer to have a key in my hand. Keys given by a jailer, Prakasam shot back. Open only the doors he chooses. The exchange made the newspapers. One was painted as an extremist, the other as a responsible statesman. But out in Andhra, where barefoot listeners crowded around rumbling presses to hear the headlines read aloud, it was the extremist, whose name began to glow. Then came 1928, and with it the Simon Commission, a 7-man committee sent from London to discuss constitutional reforms in India without a single Indian member. The insult was almost theatrical. All over the country there were calls. Simon, go back. Madras, always a city of burning noon heat and sudden tempestuous rain, prepared to receive the Commission's members with black flags and angry slogans. Congress leaders met in secret, planning the demonstration. There was one problem. The police had already banned public processions on that route. If they followed the law, their protest would be reduced to speeches in safe enclosures, sound without danger, theater without risk. If they broke it openly, they risked beatings, bullets, prison. Prakasam argued for the latter. What is the point of a protest that offends no one? He demanded in a crowded planning meeting. They must feel our refusal in their bones. The day the Commission's members were to drive through Mount Road, the city held its breath. Shops half-shuttered, windows cracked open, then quickly shut. Clouds of dust swirled as thousands gathered, ignored the prohibitory orders, and raised black flags. The British had prepared. Lines of soldiers and police formed a steel corridor. Rifles glinted under the fierce sun. An order went out. If the crowd surged, they were to be beaten back relentlessly. On that blistering afternoon, the memory that would define Tanguturi Prakasam's name for generations took shape. As the Commission's cars approached, the crowd roared, "Simon, go back!" Flags rose and fell like waves. The police began lathi charges, batons cracking against skulls and shoulders. People stumbled, fell, bled. Somewhere in the chaos, an officer shouted for the soldiers to ready their rifles. The threat was clear. One more step and they might fire. For a moment, the crowd hesitated. In that moment, a thin man in simple khadi, his hair already streaked with gray, pushed his way to the very front. He had once stood in courts under painted portraits of British kings. Now he stood in the dust in front of their guns. He turned for an instant to look at the sea of faces behind him. Workers, students, shopkeepers, women clutching children. Fear and fury mixed in their eyes. Then Tanguturi Prakasam did something that no speech could match. He took off his shirt. He bared his chest to the soldiers. He lifted his chin and walked straight forward. "If you must shoot," he shouted over the stunned silence, "shoot me first." Time telescoped. The sun seemed to hang motionless. Sweat trickled down a young constable's temple. The officer's hand trembled. This was not how natives were supposed to behave. They were supposed to cower, to plead, to run, not to offer their hearts as targets. The rifles stayed up, but the fingers did not squeeze. Someone in the crowd gave a choked sob. Then a roar tore through the street like a dam breaking. "Andhra Kesari! Andhra Kesari!" Lion of Andhra. The title stuck. By evening, the city knew. By morning, the province knew. Within days, the story of the man who had dared the empire to shoot him had spread far beyond Madras. In smoky tea shops and under banyan trees, people repeated it, adding their own flourishes, but always preserving the core image. The bare chest, the fixed gaze, the line of guns. In council halls and British clubs, he was now more than a troublesome lawyer-turned-activist. He was a symbol. Symbols are powerful. They are also dangerous. Narayan Rao watched this transformation with a sour taste in his mouth. He had spent years cultivating steady influence, earning the trust of rulers, rising step by cautious step. Then, in a single afternoon, his rival had vaulted into the hearts of the masses by risking his life for 10 unbearable seconds. The British responded in their usual language, repression. Prakasam was arrested, harassed, kept under watch. His legal practice, already sacrificed, was now a burned bridge. He tasted prison cells, the damp stench of overcrowded wards, the metallic clang of iron doors behind him. Yet each jail term only burnished his legend. When he emerged, thinner but unbowed, crowds greeted him with flowers and shouts. Mothers lifted their children to see him. "Remember this face," they would say. He did not step back. Years rolled on. Gandhi's movements rose and fell. Non-cooperation, civil disobedience, the Salt Satyagraha. Each time Prakasam threw himself in, organizing marches, courting arrest, facing lathas. He became president of the Andhra Provincial Congress Committee, the man to whom villagers turned when they wanted to petition the High Command, the voice that carried Andhra's demands to the national stage. Inside the Congress, he was both respected and feared. He was not an easy man. He spoke bluntly in meetings, refused to flatter, and did not hide his contempt for those who sniffed the direction of the political wind before taking a stand. Narayan Rao, meanwhile, climbed another ladder. He became a minister in a provincial government formed under British-framed reforms, proud of the portfolio he held, proud of the car that carried a small flag on its hood. He toured the same villages as Prakasam, but with police escorts and rehearsed speeches about gradual progress. To villagers, the contrast was stark. One man came in simple cloth and left with garlands. The other came in polished leather and left behind the faint odor of compromise. When the Second World War erupted and the British dragged India into it without consultation, Congress ministries resigned in protest. Prakasam supported the decision fiercely. "How can we fight for their freedom," he demanded, "when we still live in their chains?" War years were hard. Prices soared. Scarcity gnawed at bellies. The Quit India movement of 1942 brought another wave of arrests and shootings. By then, Prakasam was an old lion, but his roar had not softened. The British kept him under tight surveillance, sometimes behind bars, sometimes effectively muzzled. Yet history, grinding forward with a remorseless rhythm, was about to offer him a chance his younger self could not have imagined, not just to protest power, but to wield it. In 1945, exhausted by war and mounting pressure at home and abroad, Britain announced elections to provincial legislatures, this time with the clear implication that these bodies would shape the transfer of power. It was, quite simply, the last great political race before the empire began to crumble. Time once again became an enemy. The Congress had to choose candidates, draft manifestos, reach millions in a matter of months. Old rivalries flared inside the party. Who would lead? Who would be sidelined? In Madras Presidency, a sprawling complex region of Tamils, Telugus, Kannadigas, Malayalis, the stakes were enormous. Narayan Rao aligned himself with groups that argued for experience in administration, code for those who had served in British-approved ministries before. They whispered that men like Prakasam were too impulsive, too steeped in agitation, too ready to take moral stands that might cost them practical gains. "Do you really want a man who bares his chest to bullets making decisions about your budgets?" One of Rao's supporters joked acidly at a private dinner. Laughter followed. But outside those polished rooms, in towns and hamlets, the mood was different. The war, the famine, the firings had convinced millions that half measures were no longer enough. They wanted leaders who had suffered alongside them, not just signed files. When candidate lists for the 1946 provincial elections were drawn, the debates were fierce. In some constituencies, the battle lines almost came to blows. In one smoky backroom in Madras, a crucial confrontation unfolded. Senior Congress leaders sat around a table piled with papers, ashtrays overflowing. The question, who would lead the party in the Madras presidency if they gained a majority? Under the new setup, that leader would become premier, a sort of proto-chief minister. Some backed a cautious, compromise-minded figure. Others insisted that the time demanded a lion, not a clerk. At the center of the storm stood Prakasam, his hair now almost entirely gray, his face lined, his eyes still bright. "I will not beg for this role," he said, voice low but clear. "If you want a figurehead to reassure the British, choose someone else. If you want a man who will look our people in the eye and say, 'This is your government now, not your rulers,' then I am ready." Outside that room, Narayan Rao and his allies lobbied furiously to block him. They warned of unrest, of regional tensions, of Andhra versus Tamil questions that might erupt under his leadership. Every hour counted, every phone call, every visit, every whispered word was part of the race. The deadline for sending the final list to Delhi loomed. Pens hovered over papers. Telephones rattled with last-minute pleas. By the time the sun set on that decisive day, the decision was made. When the Congress swept the 1946 provincial elections in Madras, riding on a wave of anti-colonial sentiment, it was Tanguturi Prakasam whom they chose as premier. The barefoot village boy who had once begged for clerical work, the barrister who had walked away from his practice, the agitator who had offered his bare chest to British guns, was now at last at the helm of one of the largest provinces in India. As he stood in the high-ceilinged hall to take his oath, the British governor watching with the inscrutable politeness of a man trained. Not to show loss, he felt a strange chill. He had spent a lifetime attacking power from the outside. Now he was stepping inside the fortress. He placed his hand on the document, voice steady as he swore to uphold a constitution that was still half the empire's, half the people's. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched in reporters' notebooks. Somewhere in the gallery, Narayan Rao sat, his face composed, his eyes dark with a calculation that had not ended with this defeat. Outside the building, a sea of people waited, craning their necks for a glimpse of their new premier. "Andhra Kesari," they shouted. "Zindabad." Their faith in him was a roar he could almost feel physically pressing against the windows. But in a room just off the main corridor, away from the cheers, a large clock ticked on the wall. The British had already announced their intention to leave soon. No one knew whether it would take months or a few short years. Communal tensions crackled across the subcontinent. Demands for separate linguistic states bubbled under the surface of Madras presidency, especially in Andhra, whose people wanted a state of their own. Time was not on his side. He had fought an empire with words and courage. Now he had to fight poverty, division, and the impatient hopes of millions, with budgets, with laws, with compromises he had always despised. How do you remain a lion when you sit on a throne built by your old enemy? As the cheers outside grew louder, the man inside straightened his shoulders. For better or worse, Tanguturi Prakasam was no longer just a symbol of resistance. He was the government. The first time Tanguturi Prakasam walked into the Madras Secretariat as premier, he felt something more frightening than British guns: silence. Not the charged silence of a protest, not the tense quiet of a courtroom before a verdict, but the heavy, padded stillness of power. Thick carpets, ticking wall clocks, clerks bending over files as if nothing in the world had changed. For 40 years he had defined himself against an empire. Now, for the first time, there was no white officer standing between him and responsibility. The loudest enemy in the room was no longer the British. It was his own decisions. He stood in that long corridor lined with portraits of past governors, pale faces in gold frames, staring down with the calm arrogance of men who had ruled a continent, and felt an old fury rise. Without a word, he turned to his secretary. "These," he said, pointing at the portraits, "do not belong in the house of a free people. Start removing them." The secretary hesitated. "Sir, technically the Constitution is still—" "Technically," Prakasam cut in, "our people have bled enough. Take them down." Within hours, the walls looked strangely bare. Bureaucrats whispered. The British governor, informed through discreet channels, frowned but said nothing. On paper, the empire still retained ultimate authority. In the corridors, the balance had already shifted. He moved into his new office, a vast room where previous premiers had sat under a large portrait of the King Emperor. That, too, came down. In its place, he ordered a simple framed spinning wheel and a small, slightly faded tricolor. Outside, a sea of people surged at the gates, waiting for glimpses, shouting his name. Inside, the first pile of files landed on his desk with a thud that felt almost physical. Release of political prisoners, repeal of repressive ordinances, demands for jobs, for schools, for land, complaints about police brutality, budgets written in a dry language that disguised real hunger. Every sheet of paper represented a promise made in speeches, a slogan shouted in the streets. Now those promises had to be turned into orders, laws, signatures. He flipped open the first file. It was a list of men still in jail for sedition, unlawful assembly, defiance of lawful authority. In other words, for doing exactly what he had spent his life urging them to do. He didn't hesitate. "Release them," he said. "All of them, unless there is a charge of violence against civilians. And don't make them wait for weeks. I want orders issued by tonight." The Home Secretary, a cautious man with decades in service, cleared his throat. Sir, such a mass release. The police will not like it. Some of these men are nationalists, Prakasam finished. If the police have a problem with that, they can come talk to me. By the end of the week, prison gates clanged open across the province. Men who had forgotten what freedom felt like stepped out blinking into the sun, garlanded by crowds, their names shouted with his. For them, the new premier's first act was not symbolic. It was steel turned into trust. But for every file he could sign with clarity, there were 10 that were swamps. Take the police. All his life, the khaki uniform had symbolized the empire's stick. Now, technically, they answered to his home minister, and through him to the cabinet. But the mindset under those caps had not changed overnight. Many officers still saw crowds as threats, not as citizens, still looked over their shoulder to the old masters' clubs. One blazing afternoon, barely a month into his tenure, a tense telegram arrived. Workers at Madras's sprawling harbor had gone on strike, demanding better wages and food allowances. The shipping companies pushed the government hard. Restore order or commerce will suffer. The police, eager to prove their usefulness, advised lathi charges and mass arrests. The file reached his desk with a stark note. Immediate decision required. He looked at the clock. It was past noon. If the strike dragged on, cargo would rot on the docks, jobs could be lost, tempers would flare into violence. If he sent in lathis, men who had shouted, Andhra Kesari, yesterday could be lying face down in their own blood by nightfall. He walked to the window, stared out at the hazy city sprawling under the merciless sun, and made up his mind. No lathi charge, he told the Home Secretary. No firing, I will go. Sir, the man protested, alarmed. The Premier cannot go into a labor dispute personally. It will set a problematic precedent. I set my precedents in the streets long ago, Prakasam replied. Prepare a car. At the harbor, the air was thick with salt, sweat, and rage. Hundreds of workers, many bare-chested, some with their lunch tins still dangling from ropes, stood clustered near the gates, arguing. Shouting, gesturing with calloused hands. A thin line of police held them at bay, fingers twitching around their batons. When his car pulled up, there was a ripple of disbelief. The Premier, in simple khadi, stepping onto the same rough ground they trod every day. He climbed onto an upturned crate, waved for silence, and spoke without notes. You stood with us when we fought the British, he began. Now you say you must fight your own government. That means either we have failed you or someone is lying to you. Let us find out which. He listened, not for form, but really listened, as workers poured out their grievances. He summoned representatives of the shipping companies to the spot, forced them to face the men whose labor made their profits possible. He refused lunch, refused tea, stood in the heat until his kurta stuck to his back and his throat burned. By evening, a compromise was hammered out. Wage hikes staggered over months, food allowances raised immediately, a joint committee to monitor abuses. The strike ended not with batons, but with exhausted claps. That night, as the city slept, Narayan Rao read the reports with narrowed eyes. Once his rival at the bar, later his opponent in council debates, Narayan Rao now led a powerful bloc inside the Congress, men who had money, connections, and most importantly, patience. They believed in slow negotiation with capital, in quiet deals struck behind thick doors, in avoiding any step that might spook industrialists or zamindars. He is going to ruin us, Rao told a small circle of businessmen in a lamplit drawing room, the air heavy with cigar smoke. Today he humiliates your companies in front of coolies. Tomorrow he will talk of nationalizing your buses, your mills. Is this the man you want shaping policy? One of the bus magnates, a man with gold rings on each finger, leaned forward. Nationalizing transport? Is he serious? Rao smiled thinly. Too serious, leave it to me. The lion in the street is now in a cage called cabinet. The trick is to make the cage shrink. Inside that cage, the clock kept ticking. The British had announced they would quit India soon. No date, no details. In Delhi, Nehru and Patel wrestled with communal fires, with the outlines of a future constitution. In the provinces, premiers like Prakasam were expected to prove that Indians could govern themselves without letting the country break into riots and economic chaos. He threw his weight behind measures he had once only dreamed of. He pushed hard for prohibition in selected districts, arguing that the poor spent too much of their meager wages on liquor that made them easier to exploit. Liquor contractors, many of them generous party donors, fumed. He ordered the administration to begin using Indian languages more widely in offices, prodding slow English-educated clerks to accept letters in Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada. If the people cannot enter your language, he told them, you must enter theirs. He backed the idea of state-controlled road transport in key routes, arguing that private monopolies were bleeding rural passengers dry. That last move sent ripples of panic through the bus owner's lobby. By day, files and meetings drained his body. By night, he still went out to address crowds, traveling in dusty cars to small towns, telling villagers that their government now had an Indian face, and that this meant they too must shoulder responsibility. Don't expect miracles, he would say, standing under kerosene lamps while moths circled the flame. We have inherited their machines, their debts, their broken villages. We cannot fix in a year what they damaged in a century, but we can decide at least who benefits from your sweat now. The crowds believed him. For a while, inside the party, the knives sharpened. Narayan Rao worked the phones, the letters, the quiet meetings with Delhi emissaries. Premier Prakasam is a good man, he would say with a look of pained concern, but impractical. He antagonizes business, scares administrators, talks too openly about linguistic claims. At this delicate time, can we risk instability in such a key province? The central leadership, juggling a dozen emergencies, began to listen. Reports filtered in of budget deficits, of friction with senior ICS officers, of murmurs in the Tamil majority districts that the Shomi Andhra Lion favored his own people too much. One night in early 1947, long after the secretariat had emptied, he sat alone at his desk, reading a brief from Delhi that made his jaw tighten. It was couched in polite language, all about collective responsibility and the need for harmony between center and provinces. Between the lines, he could read the message clearly. Tone down, step back, stop scaring the men with money. He laid the paper down and looked up at the blank spot on the wall where the king's portrait had once hung. He had bared his chest to British bullets, expecting to die. This somehow felt worse. Death by 1,000 notes, each one bearing the stamp of his own party. The end came faster than he expected. A delegation of senior Congress leaders from Madras, some of whom had cheered his appointment less than a year earlier, arrived at his residence one steamy afternoon. They spoke in circles at first, about changing circumstances, about the need to present a united front in Delhi, about certain reservations from influential quarters. Get to the point, he said at last, eyes unwavering. They exchanged glances. It would be best, one of them murmured, for the cause, if you were to step aside in favor of a leader who can command wider consensus at this time. He let the words sit between them like a live coal. Outside, bullock carts creaked past. Somewhere, a street hawker shouted his wares. Inside, the man who had once told British soldiers to shoot him first felt a strange, distant calm. So, he said quietly, the lion disturbs the sheep. No one met his eyes. He did not bargain. He did not plead. He sent in his resignation, neatly folded without a hint of self-pity. Newspapers the next day spoke of internal party adjustments, of smooth transitions. On the streets there was confusion, then anger. Some wept, some shrugged, some muttered that all politicians were the same after all. Narayan Rao, of course, did not become premier. Delhi preferred a less obviously ambitious figure. But he had achieved what he wanted. The man whose courage had become a banner was now, once again, an outsider. Months later, when midnight came on 15th of August 1947 and the news crackled over radio sets in language trembling with emotion, at the stroke of the midnight hour when the world sleeps, Prakasam was not in power. He stood in a modest gathering in Madras, watching the tricolor climb a flagpole against the dark sky, tears glistening in his eyes, and a curious mixture of pride and loss in his chest. All his life he had fought for this moment. When it finally came, he stood not at the helm of a government, but among ordinary citizens, craning his neck like everyone else. For many men, that would have been the story's end. A glorious rise, a brief spell in office, a bitter sidelining, fade to the margins. But India was not done with him yet. Freedom brought with it a new fault line, one that cut not between rulers and ruled, but between regions, languages, identities. Scratch deep in the skin. In the vast Madras state, Tamils, Telugus, Malayalas, and Kannadigas had lived under one administrative roof for decades. Under British rule, their complaints about neglect and favoritism had been contained or ignored. In a free India, those voices grew louder. Telugu speakers, especially in the coastal districts and Rayalaseema, had long resented what they saw as Tamil dominance in Madras city and administration. They wanted their own state, where their language would not be an afterthought, where budgets would reflect their needs. For them, Tanguturi Prakasam was not just a freedom fighter. He was one of their own, the Andhra Kesari, who had shouted in Telugu to awaken their pride. He was torn. On one hand, he believed in a united, strong India. On the other, he could not deny the sting in letters he received from Andhra villages. "We fought under your banners," they wrote, "but our schools still lack teachers. Our fields still lack water. In Madras, decisions are made in a tongue that is not ours." So, in meetings of the Congress, when the question of linguistic reorganization came up, he was one of the voices insisting that ignoring these demands would be dangerous. "Language is not a toy," he warned in Delhi, towering over the table, palms flat. "It is the first sound a child hears, the rhythm of lullabies, the vehicle of thought. If you force millions to feel like strangers in their own government, you plant seeds of bitterness that outlive constitutions." Many nodded politely. Few moved with urgency. Then, in 1952, a quiet, determined man named Patti Sriramulu began a fast unto death demanding a separate Andhra state. As days turned into weeks, as his body shrank onto the thin mat, as his pulse slowed, delegations came and went, offering vague promises. Prakasam visited him, his face drawn. "Sriramulu," he said, voice thick, "your life is worth more than a boundary on a map." Sriramulu smiled faintly. "I learned sacrifice from you, Andhra Kesari," he whispered. "Now let me do my share." Delhi dithered. Madras argued. Time ran out. After 58 days without food in a small house in Madras, Patti Sriramulu's breath finally stopped. News of his death tore through Andhra like a cyclone. In Vijayawada and Guntur, in Ongole and Nellore, crowds poured into the streets. Trains were blocked, government offices attacked, portraits smashed. For 3 days, the region seethed in grief and fury. The very unity of the new nation seemed to sway. In the middle of that storm, Prakasam felt a weight settle on his shoulders heavier than any office he had ever worn. If men had to die to be heard, what meaning did his decades of speeches have? Under the pressure of street and conscience, the government of India finally agreed. An Andhra state would be created, carved out. From Madras, with its own assembly, its own ministries, its own future. Then came the next question, as sharp as a knife: who would lead it? There were younger leaders with strong bases in different regions, each eyeing the new throne. There were factions loyal to coastal districts, to Rayalaseema, to Delhi. There were businessmen who wanted a pliable man, landlords who wanted a safe one. In that crowded field, one name cut across lines: Tanguturi Prakasam. He was old now, in his 80s, his hair white, his body slower. But his very unobtrusiveness in recent years had become an asset. He had not grown fat in office. He had not built dynasties. He was still the man who had once said, "Shoot me first." Delhi agreed reluctantly. In October 1953, in the dusty town of Kurnool, chosen as the temporary capital of the new Andhra, he took oath as the first chief minister of Andhra state. The scene was almost surreal. There were no grand colonial buildings, no carved stone columns. The secretariat was a cluster of hastily prepared rooms, whitewashed walls still smelling of lime. Files were stacked on borrowed tables. Maps of the new state hung crookedly, still being adjusted where borders had been drawn in a hurry. Outside, bullock carts and jeeps clogged narrow roads. Women in bright saris sat on roofs for a glimpse. Men clung to trees. Loudspeakers crackled with patriotic songs. The dust rose in choking clouds. He stood on a makeshift dais, right hand raised, and repeated the oath in a voice that carried far beyond the small crowd. For a moment as he spoke, it was not an old man, but the young clerk from Rajamundry, the fiery barrister from Madras, the bare-chested protester on Mount Road, all fused into one figure. When he finished, the cheer that went up was tinged with desperation. This was not just about honor. This was about survival. Andhra was starting with almost nothing. No big city of its own. Madras, the jewel, remained with Tamil Nadu. No grand administrative structures. a revenue base that depended on monsoon moods. Internal suspicions between regions, each convinced the other would hog resources. He threw himself into the work as if time were a physical enemy. He rose before dawn, reading reports by the dim light of a kerosene lamp in the small government bungalow. By 7, he was already parsing files on irrigation projects, on temporary accommodations for offices, on where to park new departments that needed buildings they did not yet have. When an early flood hit parts of coastal Andhra, he did not just sign relief orders from his desk. He climbed into a jeep and drove out, jostling over half-made roads, standing ankle-deep in muddy water beside villagers staring at flattened huts. "We are building a state together," he told them, his voice ragged but firm. "It will not be done from verandas." He insisted that as many proceedings as possible be conducted in Telugu. Stiff-necked officers, used to English notes, grimaced but complied. He would call a clerk to the front of a meeting and ask him to read a document aloud in Telugu, then gently correct a misused word, more schoolteacher than ruler. In the assembly at Kurnool, sitting on simple benches in an overheated hall, he spoke of land reforms, of education, of the need to balance the demands of coastal prosperity with the dry needs of Rayalaseema. "We are one people," he said. "If one part of the body grows fat and another starves, the whole man dies." But the clock was ticking, louder than ever. The very forces that had clamored for Andhra's birth now began to pull at its limbs. Coastal leaders wanted canals and ports. Rayalaseema leaders wanted dams and special status. Every rupee in the budget became a question of identity. Whose road, whose school, whose bridge? Into this volatile mix stepped an old player with a newer, sharper game. Narayan Rao, who had watched his rival return to high office with a strange blend of irritation and fascination, saw an opportunity. He now spoke the language of stability for investors, of protecting the young state from reckless experiments. In quiet meetings with bus owners, with contractors, with those who had lost licenses under Prakasam's push for public transport, he made his pitch. "The lion has come back," he said, "but his teeth are old. Behind the roar, others will rule, unless we act." He knew exactly where to strike. When Prakasam revived his old dream, expanding state-run transport in Andhra, rationalizing routes, breaking private monopolies that gouged rural passengers, the bus lobby howled. They went to Narayan Rao. He guided them step by step on how to turn economic anger into political revolt. Inside the Andhra Congress, younger men hungry for advancement began to murmur that the old man was out of touch, that his ideological obsessions endangered the state's finances. Whispers turned into letters. Letters turned into meetings. Meetings turned into a plan. File by file, day by day, as he wrestled with the nuts and bolts of building a state, a no-confidence motion against him gathered signatures in the shadows. When word finally reached him, he was in the middle of a discussion about a new college in a dusty district town. He paused, pen in hand, as an aide slipped him a note. He read it, expression unreadable, then looked back up at the map of Andhra spread on the table. "How much will the hostel cost?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. That night, alone, he allowed himself the luxury of honesty. He stood by a window, listening to the insects scream outside in the Kurnool dark, and asked himself, had he been foolish to accept this job at his age? Was he trying to live the same kind of fearless politics in a world now addicted to calculations? The date for the no-confidence debate was set. The numbers were being counted like coins in multiple camps. Every hour, another MLA's loyalty was questioned, courted, bought, lost. He did what he had always done. He met them face to face. In small rooms and under trees, he sat opposite nervous legislators, some young enough to be his grandsons, and spoke without intimidation. "If you think I am wrong," he said, "tell me to my face. If you think I am corrupt, show me one proof. If your only reason is that I do not bow to those who pay for your campaigns, then say that also, but do not hide behind polite phrases like change of style." Some were moved, some wept. Some promised to stand by him. Then they went back to their constituencies and received other visitors, men who carried not arguments but envelopes, not reputations, but assurances from Delhi of future positions. On the morning of the debate, the small assembly in Kurnool buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Outside, crowds had gathered, some with posters supporting him, some just curious, some there to sell tea and peanuts. Whether the old lion stayed or fell, their paddies would still need water, Their sons would still dream of city jobs. Inside, under creaking fans, he rose to speak. The opposition leader read out the charges: mismanagement, impulsive policies, favoring state ownership over private initiative, alienating key stakeholders. When his turn came, he did not shuffle papers or hide behind technicalities. "I have been called many things in my life," he began, voice carrying despite his age. "A fool, an extremist, a hero, a nuisance. Today some of you wish to call me a liability." A murmur ran through the benches. "I do not deny," he continued, "that I am old. I do not deny that I believe, perhaps too passionately for your taste, that the state should not be the servant of those who own buses and breweries." He leaned forward, his eyes sweeping the room. "But understand this. The same man who stands here asking for your trust once stood before British rifles and offered his chest. I did not do that so that, in a free Andhra, your government could be run by contractors in the shadows." Silence. "If you remove me today because you genuinely believe another can serve the poor of this state better, I will go home with a lighter heart than I have carried in years. If you remove me because you are afraid to offend men with money, then remember, you cannot look your voters in the eye and call that democracy." When he finished, even some of his opponents clapped, more out of reflex than loyalty. It was not just a parliamentary speech. It was a man summing up in a few minutes the code he had lived by for half a century. Then came the vote. Names were called, one by one, in the thick, humid air. Some MLAs hesitated, voice catching. Others spoke their choice quickly, as if tearing off a bandage. The tally marks crept up on the clerk's page with merciless arithmetic. When the last name was read, the result was clear. The motion carried. The government of the Lion of Andhra had fallen. He did not wait for procedural niceties. He stood, nodded once to the speaker, and walked out, his sandals slapping softly against the worn floor. No shouting, no last-minute theatrics, just a straight-backed exit. In the corridor, a government peon stood awkwardly, clutching a bundle of files. He stepped aside hastily. The old man smiled faintly. "Don't worry," Prakasam said, almost gently. "Files will always have someone to sign them." Outside the building, the late afternoon sun beat down on the small, swelling crowd. Someone shouted, "Andhra Kesari!" Others took it up. It was not the thunderous roar of earlier years, but it was something. He climbed into a simple car, no siren, no flag, and as it pulled away from the makeshift secretariat, he glanced back once. Through an open window, he could see, just for a second, the edge of a wall where a new portrait would soon hang, replacing his. In another room, perhaps, Narayan Rao stood at a window, watching the car grow smaller, satisfied that the lion had been tamed at last. But outside the town, where the tar ended and dusty roads began, men and women still told their children stories of a time when one of their own had dared an empire to fire. What happens to a lion when the forest he fought for begins to close its doors on him? That answer would have to wait. For now, as the car bumped along the road back to a quieter life, Tangaturi Prakasam sat with his hands folded on his walking stick, on the sun slanting across his lined face, carrying with him nothing but his stubbornness, his memories, and a question that refused to die. Had it all been worth it? The first answer came the very next morning, in the ugliest possible way. Not from a statesman or a scholar, but from the man who brought his milk. For years, the milkman had greeted him with a mixture of awe and affection. "Good morning, Andhra Kesari," he would call, handing over the brass can. "You humbled the British, sir. Long life to you." This time he shuffled his feet, eyes sliding away. "Pantalu Garu," he muttered. "My nephew says, maybe I should ask for payment in advance now, since you are no longer in office." The words hung in the dim courtyard, more brutal than any Lathi charge. No longer in office. For the first time in decades, Tangaturi Prakasam was just another old man renting a modest house, with no government car waiting, no files stacked in the next room, no phone ringing with urgent summons from Delhi. The roar of crowds had faded into the scratch of sparrows on the tiled roof. He didn't rebuke the milkman. He went inside, opened a small steel trunk, and counted the coins carefully into his palm. The Lion of Andhra paid in advance. In the weeks that followed his fall, invitations dried up as if someone had shut off a tap. The same legislators who had once jostled for a photograph by his side were suddenly very busy. "She," Party workers who used to sleep on his veranda now flocked to the new power centers, learning fresh slogans with practiced ease. Only the letters did not stop. They came in bundles tied with rough string from villages whose names most in Delhi had never heard. From fishermen in Machilipatnam, from weavers in Dharmavaram, from tenant farmers in the dry heart of Rayalaseema. Pantulu Garu, they wrote in wavering Telugu, they say you lost, but in our houses your picture is still in the puja room. When will you come and see how we live now? He read everyone, lips moving silently along the lines. Loss of office had not relieved him. It had made him restless. At night, when the city noises died, he would lie awake hearing not the ticking of a clock but the slow drip of promises deferred. The doctors told him bluntly that his body could not be driven like this much longer. You are over 80, one said, peering over his spectacles. Your heart is enlarged. Your lungs are not young. If you continue these constant tours, these all-night meetings, you may have 1-2 monsoons left. No more. He listened, eyes half closed, as if the diagnosis were being delivered to someone else. Time, which he had once treated as an infinite canvas for struggle, suddenly shrank into something measurable. 1-2 monsoons, a handful of harvests, perhaps a single election. If he still wanted to bend the arc of this newborn state, he would have to race the clock. Elsewhere, Narayan Rao was racing too, against memory itself. In Madras drawing rooms and in the new power centers of Andhra, he told a smooth, attractive story to younger politicians who had never seen British bayonets up close. The time of street heroes is over, he would say, sipping his coffee. We are in the era of planning, of 5-year plans, of big dams and big companies. Emotion is for poems. Governance is for men who understand accounts. He never spoke Prakasam's name with open contempt. That would have been clumsy. Instead, he used a gentler weapon, irrelevance. Pantulu Garu was a great patriot, he would concede, hands spread. No one denies that, but now he is old-fashioned, attached to outmoded ideas of state control. We must look forward. Forward in Narayan's vocabulary meant a state where bus magnates, contractors, and sugar mill owners could do business without an old man in khadi questioning their profits in the name of peasants. But there was one arena where even Narayan could not keep him out, the question of what India itself should look like. Barely had Andhra begun to steady its feet when a larger storm gathered over the map. The government of India, prodded by agitations from various regions, had appointed a states reorganization commission. Analysts pored over census tables and linguistic charts. Lines were drawn and redrawn across faded survey maps, as if a nation could be arranged like furniture. For Prakasam, the issue was not abstract. The proposal on the table was to merge the Andhra state he had fought so hard to carve out with the Telugu-speaking districts of Hyderabad, state Telangana, to form a new, larger entity, Andhra Pradesh. To many, this Visalandra was a dream fulfilled. One language, one powerful state stretching from Srikakulam to the fringes of the Deccan Plateau. But the letters from Telangana told a more complicated story. Pantulu Garu, they wrote, our wells are dry, our schools are fewer. We fear that in a big Andhra, our voice will be swallowed by the coastal rich. Why must we merge so fast? Listen to us. The commission itself recommended caution. Perhaps Telangana should remain separate for a while to decide its future calmly, but politicians hungry for a larger stage, for more seats in parliament, pressed for immediate unification. Delhi called on the old lion for advice. He arrived in the capital not as a premier, not as a chief minister, but as a veteran whose very presence unsettled comfortable men. In the high-ceilinged room where the fate of millions would be sealed, he found Narayan already there, impeccably turned out, papers stacked in neat files. Pantulu Garu, Narayan greeted him, oozing respect. You honor us with your presence. Let us see if we honor the people. Prakasam replied dryly, taking his seat. The arguments flowed like monsoon rivers. We must not delay unity, Narayan insisted, gesturing toward a large map of peninsular India. A strong Andhra Pradesh will be a bulwark in the south. Same language, same culture. These doubts from Telangana are being exaggerated by vested interests. And what of their fears? Prakasam shot back. Have you visited the villages near Karimnagar recently? The schools in Nalgonda? When we asked for Andhra, Madras told us for years to be patient. Now you are telling Telangana what was once told to us from the other side. Pantulu Garu, another leader intervened smoothly. Your heart is soft, as always. But politics is the art of the possible. If we keep waiting for everyone to feel perfectly ready, we will never move. He leaned forward, palms flat on the polished table. I am not asking you to wait forever, he said, voice calm but edged. I am asking you to listen for 5 minutes to people who are saying, in their own words, that they are afraid. If you crush that fear under the weight of your beautiful theory of unity, it will not vanish. It will go underground, and one day it will come back like a river that has been blocked, wider, angrier, with no bank strong enough to hold it. Silence settled over the room for a moment. Even Narayan's pen paused above the paper, but the tide of convenience was too strong. Gentlemen's agreements were drafted, assurances made, neatly typed and filed, that Telangana's interests would be protected. The ink dried faster than the doubts. On 1st November 1956, as fireworks burst in some towns and uneasy processions marched in others, the map changed again. Andhra Pradesh was born. Prakasam watched the celebrations from the edge, face thoughtful. Another state, another experiment, another set of expectations that would one day crash against the jagged rocks of reality. He had done what he could to warn them. The rest was no longer in his hands. What was in his hands, he decided, was the example he could set in the time he had left. He began traveling again, not as the head of a government, but as a wandering conscience. He went to villages where farmers still plowed behind weary oxen, to small towns where students now learned their lessons in Telugu, because men like him had argued for it when it was unfashionable, to weaving clusters where fingers danced on looms producing cloth that could not compete with mill-made shirts flooding the bazaar. In a dusty mandapam one evening, a young man stood up, face burning with a mix of anger and confusion. Pantulu Garu, he blurted out, you went to jail. You bared your chest to the British. You became chief minister twice. And still, our well is dry, my father has debts, my brother is in the city pulling a rickshaw. What was the use of all that courage, of all that sacrifice? The question cut sharper than any opposition speech. He looked at the boy for a long moment, seeing not just one face but a whole generation's disappointment staring back at him. Tell me, he said quietly, when your brother came to the city, did he have to carry a pass signed by a white officer to move from one street to another? No, the boy muttered. Did the policeman who stops him speak to him in a tongue he can understand or in a language he cannot answer? In Telugu, the boy conceded. Do you write your own name on these petitions? He asked, holding up a crumpled sheet the villagers had given him. Or does someone else sign for you? I write it myself. Then, Prakasam said, understand this. Freedom does not fill wells by itself. It does not cancel debts by itself. It does something quieter but more dangerous. It puts the tools in your hands. Whether you use them or let others use them against you will decide if our courage was wasted. He did not pretend that this answer was enough. But he refused to lie. In private, he also refused something else. Comfort bought at the cost of integrity. Offers came in low, tempting voices. Pantulu Garu, why not accept the post of governor? It is mostly ceremonial. You can rest, you will have a fine house, a car, an honorable last chapter. Pantulu Garu, join us again properly. We can make you chairman of this board, president of that committee. You deserve these honors. He smiled, shook his head. I did not enter politics, he would reply, to cut ribbons and sign guest books. Instead, he did something that utterly baffled the new rich of Andhra. He began to give away what little he had left. When Vinoba Bhav's Bhudan movement reached the Telugu countryside, asking landowners to gift portions of their holdings to the landless, Prakasam did not just clap politely from the front row. He stood up in meeting after meeting and urged others to part with their acres. How can we preach sacrifice to peasants, he would demand, if we will not loosen our own grip on earth that others till for us? It was not a popular message in drawing rooms, but in one gathering, under a peepal tree as dozens of farmers watched, he signed away the rights to the last significant piece of ancestral land that tied his family to comfort. When he handed over the document, a murmur ran through the crowd. Some gasped, some whispered that the old man had finally gone mad. To Narayan, hearing of this, it was proof of what he had always believed. See, he told his friends with a thin smile, he has no sense of property, of capital. Such men are dangerous in power. But there was a quiver in his tone that even he did not fully understand. For all his success, for all the air-conditioned offices he now moved through, there was a thin, persistent thread of envy for a man who could walk away from comfort without bargaining. Time, however, was not inclined to bargain with Prakasam. His cough worsened. Climbing even a short flight of stairs left him breathless. Yet he insisted on one last punishing tour to see with his own eyes what this newborn Andhra Pradesh looked like beyond the speeches. In early 1957, against his doctor's advice, he boarded a rattling train to Hyderabad, now the capital of the enlarged state. The city that had once been the seat of a nizam now hummed with new ministries, new bureaucrats, new arguments. He arrived not to fanfare but to a small group of old colleagues at the station. His frame was thinner, his gait slower, but his eyes still scanned the crowd for the faces of ordinary people rather than the familiar cream of political functionaries. A students' union insisted he address them at the Osmania campus. Only 10 minutes, the doctor said nervously. No more. He ended up speaking for 40. He talked not of his glory days, but of theirs to come, if they were ready to pay a different kind of price. You will not be asked to stand in front of British guns, he told the rows of restless young men and women, but you will be tempted, every day, to stand in front of a weaker neighbor and take what is his. Your test will not be how loud you can shout Bharat Mata Ki Jai, but how quietly you can say no when someone offers you a shortcut that dirties your hands. When he stepped down from the dais, his legs trembled. For a moment the world swam. The cheering faces blurred into a wash of color. He clutched at the edge of the table, recovered, forced himself to smile. That night, in a modest room in Hyderabad, pain gripped his chest like a tightening iron band. He insisted at first that it was just gas, that he had survived far worse in British jails. But when the second wave came, fiercer, he could not stifle the groan. They rushed him to hospital under flickering streetlights. In the whitewashed ward that smelled of antiseptic and fear, the doctors bent over him with stethoscopes and syringes. An oxygen mask misted against his beard. The man who had once walked bare-chested toward rifles now lay tethered to tubes, his life measured in heartbeats dancing on a green line. News spread quickly through Hyderabad's cramped lanes and wide new roads alike. Andhra Kesari was in hospital. Outside, a small crowd gathered, growing by the hour. Rickshaw pullers, students, clerks, women with babies on their hips. They could not see him. They could only stand facing the building as if their presence might somehow keep his pulse steady. Narayan arrived too, hesitating in the corridor before pushing open the door to the private room where his old rival lay propped on. Pillows, every breath a labor. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them thick with years of arguments, disappointments, victories, and grudges. So, Prakasam managed, voice a rasp but eyes still bright. You have come to see if the lion's roar is finally gone? Narayan tried to smile, but it came out crooked. I came, he said quietly, to ask you something before time steals the chance. Prakasam raised an eyebrow. Was it worth it? Narayan blurted. All of it. The jails, the hunger, the quarrels with your own party, the stubborn refusals. You could have lived comfortably. Governor, chairman, respected elder. Instead, you chose this. He gestured helplessly at the bare hospital room, the absence of any obvious wealth or privilege. For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of oxygen. Then, very slowly, the old man lifted a hand and pointed toward the window. Open it, he whispered. Narayan obeyed. Warm night air drifted in, carrying with it the low murmur of the crowd outside. Snatches of conversation, a child crying, someone starting a hesitant song of freedom learned from older throats. Listen, Prakasam said. Narayan did. That is your answer? He asked at last, baffled. A few dozen people in the dark? His rival's eyes flashed. Not a few dozen, he said. Behind them stand the ones you don't see. The boy in a village school reading in Telugu, the girl crossing the Krishna over a barrage that did not exist when I was young, going to college instead of to the fields, the farmer who writes his own name on a land deed, the worker who dares to organize because he has seen that men can bring down empires. His voice grew fainter, but the words did not lose their edge. I did not fight, he continued, so that I could die in silk sheets. I fought so that those I will never meet could stand a little straighter. If they do, even a little, then yes, it was worth it. Every bruise. Narayan looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time, stripped of myth and exaggeration. For a fleeting instant, he envied him with an ache that went beyond politics. He left the room without trusting himself to speak further. In the early hours of 20th of May 1957, as Hyderabad dozed and the nurses moved softly along the corridors, the green line on the monitor above Tangaturi Prakasam's bed stuttered, steadied, and then very gently went flat. The lion's heart, which had outlasted Raj prisons and party betrayals, had finally spent itself. Word leaped like fire through dry grass. By dawn, the crowd outside the hospital had grown into a river of humanity. Office-goers in neatly pressed shirts, coolies with towels knotted around their heads, women who had never seen his face but had heard their mothers describe his bare chest on Mount Road. They all came. There were no fancy posters printed in advance. People tore strips from old cloth, scrawled Andhra Kesari with charcoal, held them aloft with trembling hands. The government, jolted, announced state honors. Wreaths arrived, heavy with official ribbons. Leaders who had sidelined him for years now stood in front of microphones, voices solemn, speaking of a great son of India, of irreparable loss. But outside the scripted speeches, something raw was happening in the streets of Andhra. In towns far from Hyderabad, schools closed themselves without waiting for orders. In villages, men took off their slippers before the crackling radio set as if entering a temple. In Rajamundry, where a young clerk had once looked at the world and decided to fight it, shopkeepers pulled down their shutters and lit small oil lamps on their thresholds. Narayan watched the funeral procession from a balcony, the white-clad body on the gun carriage moving slowly through an ocean of heads. Every now and then a chant would swell, Prakasam Pantulukije, then break into sobbing. He realized with a sudden cold clarity that he had miscalculated. Power counted its victories in files and appointments, in contracts signed and motions passed. But history, stubborn and unpredictable, counted differently. It tallied courage, stubbornness, the willingness to stand alone in front of a line of guns or a hall full of party men. Long after the fat contracts had changed hands and the names of minor ministers had been forgotten, barefoot boys would still look up at the statue of a man with his chest bared on Mount Road and ask, "Who was he?" Someone would answer, "That is Tangaturi Prakasam, the Lion of Andhra. He told the British to shoot him first." Perhaps they would not remember which budget he passed, which file he signed, which speech brought down which government, but the image, the stance, the refusal to flinch, that would remain. Years later, when the sun slants gold across the wide sweep of the Prakasam barrage in Vijayawada, children lean over the railing, watching the Krishna churn below. They do not always know that the very bridge they are standing on carries his name. They only know that it feels solid under their feet, away from one shore to another. In classrooms across Andhra Pradesh, lessons are still written on blackboards in Telugu. A schoolmaster, dusting his hands, tells his students that there was a time when this seemed impossible, when petitions had to be written in a foreign tongue to be read at all. Somewhere in that explanation, the name Prakasam Pantulu surfaces, like an old stone in a river that refuses to be buried. In the legislature, new men and women argue over budgets and policies. Some grumble about old portraits staring down at them. Among those faces is one with a high forehead and fierce eyes, wrapped in plain khadi. A few glance up, feel vaguely watched, and straighten their spines. And in a small house preserved in Rajamundry, tourists sometimes stand in a narrow room where a clerk once pored over law books by the light of a smoking wick. They see a walking stick, a pair of simple spectacles, a faded tricolor. The guide tells the story of how this man walked into gunfire unarmed, how he refused honors, how he died with little money but a vast invisible wealth of respect. What happens to a lion, someone might ask, when the forest changes, when the trees are cut down, when the hunters become the law? The answer, perhaps, is this. If he roars loudly enough for long enough, the echo outlives the forest. In the end, Tangaturi Prakasam's real office was never a secretariat in Madras or a makeshift building in Kurnool. It was a space inside the minds of ordinary people where fear loosened its grip, where the idea took root that a poor man from a small town could look power in the eye and refuse to bend. That office has no term limits. It cannot be toppled by a vote of no confidence. And as long as somewhere in Andhra a boy or girl hears his story and decides, in some small moment of their own life, not to be afraid, the old man's whispered verdict on his deathbed will remain true. It was worth it. Every bruise, every betrayal, every breath.